It was 1939 in Warsaw, Poland. Every morning, the zookeeper and his wife would awaken to the sounds of animals greeting the day. Peacocks and cuckoos, hyenas and lions. But then the German army invaded Poland. The animal sounds were replaced by the sounds of planes overhead, gunfire, and explosions around the city. As the Jews of Warsaw were rounded up by the invading army, the zookeeper and his wife secretly began sheltering them and members of the Polish resistance in their home and in the cages and enclosures once occupied by their animals. Author Diane Ackerman tells the remarkable story of Jan and Antonina Zabinski, whose courage and ingenuity saved hundreds of people from death at the hands of the Nazis. The book is called The Zookeeper's Wife, and she joins me in the studio. Diane, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Lovely to be here.
How did you come across Jan and Antonina Zabinski and this story?
I came to them through the animals, actually. My grandparents came from Poland, and I had heard that there was a primeval forest and horses running around in it that were very ancient, that were the kind of horses that had been drawn on the cave walls during the Ice Ages. And I wondered how on earth they got there. As I kept just poking around a little bit here, a little bit there, I kept turning up such astonishing things. Ultimately, that Jan Zabinski, the zookeeper in Warsaw, was very much involved with this, that the primeval forest only existed because of Nazi perversity, and I just kept pursuing it.
Over the course of the war, the Zabinski family sheltered over 300 people. What would have happened to them had they been caught or found out?
Oh, they would have been shot on the spot, everybody. And I think this was especially hard for their small child, Rish, who was 5, 6, 7 during the war. Because if you think about it, there were all of these amazing dramas taking place around him every day, but he was not allowed to talk about it. And I'm sure he had been told that if he mentioned anything to anyone, his parents would be killed, everyone he knew would be killed, he would be killed, and it would be his fault.
And did that impact his ability to make friends and just have a normal childhood?
It really did. He decided, understandably, that he should just not make friends at school, and instead he would come back each day and play with the animals. Because as it happened, Antonina didn't just take in refugees. She also adopted lots of orphan wild animals, and she raised them by hand right in the house. And so her son became a small zookeeper himself, looking after a menagerie of animals.
At one point, he had a little piglet that he was taking care of in the house and grew quite attached to it.
Yes, they were best friends. The piglet would listen to him for long periods of time without complaining. But unfortunately, the piglet also grew used to humans being benign, and when some Nazi soldiers showed up, didn't know to stay away from them, and the Nazis grabbed the piglet and took it off to be slaughtered. The little boy was inconsolable for months.
You know, given the immense danger that they lived in, they even carried cyanide pills with them. Why did they do it?
Oh, well, you know, they were Catholic rescuers, and people have interviewed many such rescuers, and it's interesting, they all say the same thing, that they weren't really heroes, that anyone in their position would have done the same thing, that it was simply the human thing to do. In their case, they both were very compassionate people before the war. They had a lively zoo that was open to the arts. It was really the heart of the city. And then their zoo was bombed, and they were horrified by that, but they were far more horrified by Nazi racism. And this was especially true for Jan, whose father was an atheist and didn't want his son to have to go to a Catholic school. So he sent him to a Jewish school. And so Jan grew up with Jewish friends who went on to become the leading scientists, intellectuals, and so on, and ended up in the ghetto. So for Jan, this had to do partly with loyalty to boyhood friends.
What happened to the original animals that were at the zoo? Did they survive?
Some of them were killed outright, quite a few, but others ran free. And they ran across the bridge into downtown Warsaw.
What kind of animals are we talking about,
Oh,
Diane?
we're talking about lions and tigers running next to antelope and seals and predator and prey running safely next to each other at speed. And people who were brave enough to look out of their windows on that day reported a kind of biblical hallucination unfolding. It was like Noah's Ark. They did not expect to see camels on the cobblestones. It was a very strange sight. And some of them ran into the outlying fields. But most of them were indeed killed. And so the Zabinskis had those slaughtered and gave the food to the poor.
Diane, would you read us a section in your book that you describe the zoo being bombarded?
Yes. It begins, Nazi bombers attacked Warsaw in 1,150 sorties, devastating the zoo, which happened to lie near anti-aircraft guns. On that clear day, the sky broke open and whistling fire hurtled down. Cages exploded. Moats rained upward. Iron bars squealed as they wrenched apart. Wooden buildings collapsed, sucked down by heat. Glass and metal shards mutilated skin, feathers, hooves, and scales indiscriminately as wounded zebras ran ribboned with blood. Terrified howler monkeys and orangutans dashed caterwauling into the trees and bushes. Snakes slithered loose, and crocodiles pushed onto their toes and trotted at speed. Bullets ripped open the aviary nets, and parrots spiraled upward like Aztec gods and plummeted straight down. Other tropicals hid in the shrubs and trees or tried to fly with singed wings. Some animals, hiding in their cages and basins, became engulfed by rolling waves of flame. 2 giraffes lay dead on the ground, legs twisted, shockingly horizontal. The clotted air hurt to breathe and stank of burning wood, straw, and flesh. The monkeys and birds, screeching infernally, created an otherworldly chorus, backed by a crackling timpani of bullets and bomb blasts. Echoing around the zoo, the tumult surely sounded like 10,000 furies scratching up from hell to unhinge the world.
That's Diane Ackerman reading from her book, The Zookeeper's Wife. After the Nazis came into Warsaw, among other things, they held a shooting party to kill off all the rest of the animals that were in the zoo. Why did
Yes.
they do that?
Well, there's a curious character who shows up in the book and who really did exist named Lutz Heck. He was a very high-ranking German. He was head of the Berlin Zoo, but he was also a big game hunter. And he didn't mind shooting animals if they happened to belong to somebody else.
Which is strange, given that he was a zookeeper himself.
Exactly. It was very strange. On the one hand, he told the Zabinskis that he was going to protect them since they were colleagues, and he was going to take their prized animals and send them to safety in Germany.
You mean steal them?
Steal them. That is what happened, but that's not how he put it. And on the other, he suddenly showed up on New Year's Eve with a whole bunch of Gestapo people with guns. They were drunk, and they just rambled around the zoo, shooting animals in their habitats. For Antonina, this was about as horrible as she could imagine, and she quickly took her son as far indoors as she could, and tried to distract him by reading from one of his favorite books, Robinson Crusoe. But every time she heard gunfire, she just froze, knowing what was taking place, froze in horror.
How did Jan and Antonia start opening up their house then to the Jews, to other people that were fleeing from the Nazis?
When the zoo was bombed, they decided that they were going to do something incredibly risky. But it seemed like their moral duty. And that was to take all of the bombed cages and other places and fill them with refugees who were escaping. So Jan first, through very clever deceits, found ways to get into the ghetto, and he would sneak one person out after another, sneak them into the zoo through the lion's cage, which was not at all easy because there were German garrisons all over. And from there, he spirited them through an underground tunnel into the pheasant cage and from there to the house. So there would be like 50 people at a time who were hidden between the walls, in the closets, in the cages, underground. And because it would have been dangerous to mention names of illegal people, they were all given the names of the animals that had once lived in the cages.
There was even a squirrel family.
There was a squirrel family. Yes, after Antonina accidentally dyed all of their hair red instead of blonde, they became the squirrels. But this made it easier because then she could hand her son a bowl of soup and a hunk of bread and say, "The lions are hungry. Go feed the badgers." And speaking of badgers, among the animals in the household, there was a pet badger who slept right in bed with Riche, and also used his training potty as it was intended. And there was a predatory carnivorous rabbit that would leap onto the dinner table and steal food. There was a cat that was being encouraged to nurse baby foxes, newborn foxes, which barked, and that disturbed her some. But as a result, there were baby foxes all over the house. There was a muskrat trying to build a hutch in a stovepipe. Lots of animals.
Now, you say that there could have been about 50 people in the house at one time. Was this a very large house?
It was a pretty good-sized villa. And the odd thing about it, or the best thing about it, is that it was in the Bauhaus style and had many tall windows. So these people were being hidden in plain sight. And Jan's thinking was that the Germans would never suspect anybody would be crazy enough to hide people in so open and accessible a place. And he guessed right, but there were many near misses.
What sorts of people did they shelter?
They seemed to specialize in artists, professors, scientists, intellectuals. Jan and Antonina themselves had backgrounds in zoology, but also in the fine arts. There was a famous sculptress there named Gross, Magdalena Gross, and she had been making sculptures of the various animals at the zoo, and at one point she showed up there. And then a little bit later on, her sweetheart showed up too, and they ultimately became engaged and married. Babies were born. You know, it sounds odd, but as much as possible, theirs was a festive existence inside of this house. They knew what was happening outside. They had been in the ghetto. They had friends in the ghetto. But the most extraordinary thing about Antonina was that she was determined that everybody survive with humanity, not just survive. So there would be piano concerts after dark. There was art. There was conversation, socializing. And, of course, there was always the innocence of the animals to talk about.
But I find this extraordinary, given what's going on around them, and more importantly, not knowing how long this is going to last.
Yes.
Or if this is going to be permanent. Mm-hmm. I mean, they don't have, the benefit that we have of knowing, well, in another couple of years, the Allies are going to defeat Germany.
That's a very good point. And I think that Antonina practiced a kind of mindfulness that's really rather Buddhist, all things considered. But it was also a mindfulness that was being practiced in the ghetto by the Hasidic rabbi who was there and who was guiding his flock to meditate on the beauty of nature and to meditate watching their thought patterns and so on. In other words, to distract them with beauty, with fascination, and get their minds off of the war so that they could transcend. And there was also the head of the orphanage in the ghetto who was leading his children in transcendent theater and encouraging them to practice mindful chores, also for the same reason. Both of these men could have gotten out of the ghetto. They were offered many opportunities, but they chose to stay for the sake of their flock, their followers.
What happened to those children in the orphanage in the ghetto?
Ultimately, they were loaded on a train and taken away to the extermination camp. And Janusz Korczak, who was the head of the orphanage, decided that he would have to go with them because you don't abandon children when they're as frightened as that. And he knew that his mere presence would help keep them calm throughout the ordeal.
That's Diane Ackerman. She's an award-winning author. She's published many works of nonfiction and poetry. The book we're discussing is called The Zookeeper's Wife, a war story. Diane, why did you decide to focus on Antonina, the zookeeper's wife, rather than Jan, who had a very interesting experience?
He did, but he was heroic in more traditional ways. He was the head of a cell of saboteurs that specialized in blowing up trains, and he did all kinds of mischievous and clever things, diabolical things, working with the resistance. But he always said that the real hero of this drama was his wife, because she was frightened, terribly frightened. But she decided instead to be courageous, and as I say, to be courageous in a deeply compassionate way. We live in a time when we don't celebrate heroes who perform acts of mercy and heroism of this sort. Instead, we identify heroes as being warriors. It's always about combat. But during any periods of genocide, right now on our war-torn planet, there are people who are being equally altruistic. It's just that we don't highlight that aspect of human nature. And yet it is profoundly, deeply part of the human condition also to be compassionate, to be altruistic, and so on.
You said that there was lots of near misses. Tell us about some of those.
Because the zoo still looked very much like a park, very often Nazis would stop by. They would just take a stroll in the park, and while they were there, they would go over and say hello to the zookeepers, and so on. On one occasion, a couple of Nazis brought an eagle that they wanted the zookeepers to keep. On another occasion, a man showed up and said that he was there to look at a collection of insects. And Jan said afterwards that he thought, this is it. This is the end for us. But in truth, this turned out to work very well in his favor, because it happened that this insect lover was friends with a friend of Jan's in the ghetto who had told him that Jan was keeping for him 250,000 insects that had been collected. The two men made friends. Jan exploited this relationship, and through it, he went into the ghetto through a kind of secret back door and was able to smuggle people out, all because of the insects.
At one point, some very irate German soldiers came and accused them of setting fire to, I guess, one of the German offices nearby.
Yes.
How did she handle that?
First of all, her best ploy when dealing with the Nazis who were threatening her was to have her mind work like on two levels. So she would be talking out loud and telling them wonderful things about German culture and history and how marvelous she thought it was. But subconsciously, she would be saying, calm down, go away, drop your weapons, calm down. And she would be radiating this kind of calm. And then she also said to them out loud, now, why on earth would we set fire to hay? Why would we risk our lives like this? Actually, I can tell you exactly what happened. There were some of your soldiers. They were romancing their sweethearts in the hay. They had a cigarette, and that's what happened. It went up in fire. She managed to stay so calm throughout that they believed her.
She didn't seem like she was lying anyway.
She didn't seem like she was lying. No. She was very clever in how she dealt with them.
There's a story in the book that took place towards the end of the Nazi occupation. 2 SS officers showed up at the house yelling that the Poles would pay for the deaths of the, quote, heroic German soldiers. Tell us that story.
This was really a horrible thing. They said that 1,000 Poles were going to be killed for every SS officer who had been killed. And so they demanded that everybody come out of the house. And there was somebody staying with them they called Foxman. And Foxman had a 15-year-old assistant. They ordered the 15-year-old behind a shed. One of the SS officers went there. Antonina heard a single shot. At this point, she was holding in her arms a newborn baby. And she was afraid that she and her baby would also be killed. And when they ordered her son to go behind the shed, She wanted very much to run and throw herself in front of him, but then the baby would be killed too. And so she had to watch in horror as her small child went behind the shed and another gunshot came out, but then it turned out that both of the boys came back. They hadn't been killed, only a rooster had been killed, and the soldiers laughed and said, "Hey, we played a great joke on you."
Not very funny.
Not very funny.
In 1945, the Germans were finally driven out of Poland. Much of the country was destroyed. What happened to the zoo and the Zabinskis after the war?
They were separated during the war. Jan was wounded in the neck, and he ended up in a POW camp. And Antonina had a lot of adventures as she fled the city. But they all reunited at the zoo after the war. And the citizens of Warsaw contributed 300 animals to get the zoo back on its feet. Some of the animals that had escaped down the cobblestone streets were returned. Badger was returned, which was great. And they were able to open the zoo in 1949, but the Soviets came in. And then it was not at all popular to be a freedom fighter. And I think
like Jan had been.
Exactly. There's no record of exactly why he retired so soon thereafter, but I am convinced that that's what it was, that he had been persuaded to do that. He did not retire, however, from a life with animals. He did weekly radio broadcasts about the behavior of animals, and Antonina wrote children's books.
What about the little boy, Riche?
I met him as a grown-up. What a thrill that was. He's now in his 70s. The whole time I was talking with him, I just kept seeing him at 7. I don't know if he could tell or not. He was kind enough to go with me to the zoo, and we walked through the house, which stands, into the different rooms, and he could tell me what happened where and what had changed. And I could lie down on a bed in Antonina's bedroom and stand on the terrace and look out at the zoo and the city in the way that she did. It was very thrilling.
That's Diane Ackerman, award-winning author. The book is called The Zookeeper's Wife, A War Story. It's published by W.W. Norton. Diane, thanks so much for being on the program.
Thank you.
You're listening to The Mimi Geerges Show. You can find us on the web at mgshow.org.